In Parshas Nitzavim, Hashem makes a covenant through Moshe Rabbeinu with the Jewish people, and Moshe says that the covenant is both with those who are present physically today and those who are not presently today, which obviously refers to those who will still come in the future, which is what Rashi tells us. And the question is, why does Rashi tell us that? Surely it is self-evident. So initially, we believe that Rashi is trying to tell us that the whole chiddush of this pasuk is that even people who are not currently present, like those who would be born in the future, or those who would convert to Judaism, are included in this bris. We're going to find 7 different reasons why that's not a good enough explanation, and therefore come to the conclusion that actually what Rashi is telling us is not simply that they're included in the covenant, but specifically that the way the covenant works is equal both to those who are physically present at the time Moshe is speaking and those who will emerge in future. And that teaches us a great lesson about how the Jewish people over the course of the entire history remain one connected, united organism. When it comes to the covenant that was made at the beginning of our parasha, it says like this: not just with you am I making this covenant. It applies to those who stand here today before Hashem, as well as those who are not currently here with us. Rashi comments, Rashi quoting those words, and those who are not currently here. Rashi says that means that means that this bris extends even to those nations, those generations, I should say, that are still to come in the future. So what's Rashi telling us? That we wouldn't automatically know. Most of the commentaries point out, what Rashi wants to negate here is that you might have thought maybe there's some Jews around who were alive at the time but didn't arrive at that particular assembly. And maybe that's what Moshe is talking about when he says those who are not here today. That you cannot say. That's an impossible suggestion, because just look at how the parasha began. The parasha began by saying that you're all standing here, every single Jewish person. So it's unthinkable that of those Jews who were alive at the time, some were not present. The Torah made it clear that every single Jew at the time was there. And therefore the Mefarshim say that has to be why Rashi explained that who is not currently here, those who are still going to be born in the future. But I'm sure you already realize that that's not a clear enough explanation, because if Taka, the pasuk says clearly that you're all standing here today, then obviously you realize the Torah already said that everybody who's alive then is at that assembly. So obviously, even without Rashi, you know that whoever is not there must refer to people who are not yet born. So Rashi So what did Rashi tell us that we don't already know? That it's referring to future generations. Well, that's obvious. Obviously, it's referring to future generations. So and so therefore, all of the Mefarshim want to suggest the following extra insight to help us to understand why Rashi had to point out what theoretically we should have known already. And that's what we're going to analyze in the Sikha, what the Mefarshim was suggesting. Because Lulei Pirish Rashi, were it not for Rashi's commentary, it actually would have been quite difficult, even though it's logical, it would have been difficult to suggest that the Krisus Bris applies to people who are not yet here, generations that will come in the future. Why not? Because surely in the same way as there's a halacha that you can't buy something that doesn't yet exist, and you cannot contract with someone who hasn't yet been born, surely you cannot make a covenant with a generation that hasn't yet come into this world. So therefore the Mefarshim tell us that's exactly what Rashi comes to teach us, that that's exactly what the Torah wants us to know, that even though it is illogical and even against some of the laws of the Torah, nevertheless in this situation it is possible to make a covenant, to contract with generations that don't yet exist, that haven't yet been born. Why? For 2 reasons. Number 1, Aleph, Sharei Aleph Nishmesem Hoyusham, Uchris Arbis Oisimon. Firstly, because they may not have been there physically, but their neshamas were present at the time, and so the covenant was made with their neshamas. Number one. Number two, because we have a principle in Torah which says that a child is like the leg, a limb, in other words, an extension of the parent. Therefore, all future generations who are the descendants of these people are automatically included in the Christus bris. So according to the Mefarshim, it's logical based on the wording in the parasha that it must refer asher inenu poi to generations that are yet to come. But that does raise a practical problem. How do you contract with people who are not yet here? So that's what Rashi comes to teach us. Guess what? It can actually happen, and we have two logical explanations for it. Either because it was a bris with their neshamas, or because it was a bris that occurs because of the way that they are an extension of their parents. And this is where we have 7 issues with the interpretation of the Mefarshim. We have to understand the following things. Number 1, Aleph. We know, as the Rebbe has explained multiple times, Rashi Kosav is Pirusha Boyfan Kozeh Shagam Ben Chamish Nemikra Yuchal Avim Miteich Dvar Pshat HaPasuk. Rashi designed his commentary to be in such a way that a 5-year-old can understand the simple meaning of the pasuk without having to consult other commentaries. Now, these concepts that we've just raised, does the 5-year-old know them? So therefore that raises a question for us. There's nowhere in Chumash up until this point that would have taught the 5-year-old that there's a principle that a child is an extension of the parent. How would he know this? How would he be able to assume it? And the truth is, there is no clear evidence in the Pshat that would help the 5-year-old know that the neshamas would be present at this covenant. So therefore, if Rashi's intention is to offer this innovative insight, Rashi wants to explain to us how it is feasible to make a covenant with people who have not yet been born. Should have explained it. Where's the 5-year-old supposed to know this information? Rashi should have spelt out in clear terms how that is actually possible. Either he should have told us that the neshamas were present, or he should have introduced the child to the principle that a child is an extension of the parent. Rashi didn't do that, so how should the 5-year-old know? Question number 1. How does the 5-year-old know things that perhaps you and I know because we've learned other things that would answer this question? The truth is, it's even a greater question than that. Because the idea that those who are not present may refer to future generations, the child could have worked that out on his own, as we already mentioned earlier, because the pasuk says that everybody who was alive then is present. So a thinking child will say, okay, everybody who's alive is already here. So who's not here? Must be people who are not yet alive. So therefore what Rashi comes to teach us is not that the words those who are not here refers to the future, but rather Rashi is telling us how it should work, because I know it refers to the future. So now I have the question, how can you make a bris of the future? Rashi hasn't even alluded to a method by which you could make a covenant with future generations. All he said is that you could also, or it also applies to future generations. Which would imply that the main thing that Rashi should be conveying is not there in his words. Gimel, question number 3. The truth is that the principle of making some kind of a deal or covenant or contract with people who are not yet born has already appeared earlier in the Torah, and Rashi didn't ever seem to get into the how does it work, so why now? For example, Bris ben Abesarim ois b'shaychas l'zarei shel Avram. Hashem made a covenant with Avram Avinu, Bris ben Abesarim, that was going to affect his children. Shavoi lacha kama doros. It was actually going to only apply many generations later. Val derech zeh b'pashas b'chukoisai. The entire principle of contracting with the Jewish people, if you do my mitzvahs, you'll be blessed, etc., in Pashas b'chukoisai, that's right across the span of all generations. Kain roiv mitzvah shetziva HaKadosh Baruch Hu alidei Moshe Rabbeinu mitzvah shenitztav l'doros. And the truth is that just about every mitzvah, if you think about it, that Moshe ever gave the hidden, applies to all generations. So surely the question should have arisen already all the way back then in Pashas Lech Lecha or Bechuk Koisai or somewhere else in the Torah. We should have asked the question, how can you make a deal with Avram Avinu that is binding for us generations and generations later? How can you make a deal with Moshe Rabbeinu that is binding for all generations? Rashi doesn't ever tackle it. So why now suddenly is it such a big question? And Rashi has to ask the question, how do we make a bris with Asher enenu poi? Dalet. The Gemara, in addition to telling us that those who are not here refers to future generations, also adds that it refers to converts. And the truth is, if you think about it logically, there is no reason to assume that this covenant between Hashem and the Yidden would exclude Gerim. Just like a ger is incorporated into every other area of Judaism, obviously this covenant is also included. Look at what it says at the list, because at the beginning of the Pasha gives a list of all the different kinds of Jews. It says that it includes the Gerim. So now they move on. Now, the Mefarshim wanted to suggest two possible reasons why it is possible that future generations are included in this covenant. Neither reason that the Mefarshim suggest, according to Pshat, would work for a ger. Because you cannot use the expression that a child is an extension of the parent for a ger, because their parents were not there at the time of the covenant, and they are not the biological children of those who were there at the time of the covenant. So that would fail for them. And according to Pshat, it also doesn't make sense that their neshamos would have been present at this time to make the covenant. Because according to Pshat, which is the perception of a 5-year-old child, when a ger converts, he gets a new neshama. So that neshama wasn't present at the time of this particular covenant. Which means we still have the question, how could a covenant now impact gerim that are going to come in the future? Because the two principles that we believe would work across the generations don't apply to a ger. Now let's flip that question and look at it from a different perspective. Because it is the most logical thing in the world to assume that if there's a covenant with all Jews, it must include Gerim as well. Why then does Rashi not talk about it in his commentary? He only says future generations. And he doesn't even say the words similar to what the Gemara says. He leaves out the Gerim. Now, it's logical to us the Gerim are included, so surely they should be part of the conversation. In fact, Rashi should dafka have highlighted the Gerim because it's a greater surprise to us that they are incorporated in the covenant, because they don't have the two reasons which logically we want to say are the reason why the covenant applies across the generations. Vov. Now, what Rashi has said that the words those who are not here today refers to generations who will come in the future. That is the language of the Medrash Tanchuma. Whereas, if you look at the same conversation as it's presented in both versions of the Gemara, it's said differently. There it says, Doros haboim, coming generations. So we have to understand what is the difference between saying coming generations and saying generations that will be in the future, and why does Rashi take the latter? So we have to understand, obviously we know that Rashi gets his interpretation from the Pshat and not from a particular rabbinic source. Mikol Mokim, Me'achashak Teichen Pirushu HaTeichen Shebedivrei Razal, seeing as Rashi is conveying the same message as Chazal want to convey, so Haya Matim Yosel Lichaira, surely it would have been more suitable, Shin Koit Lashon Kitzara Haboyim, Animsis B'Shas, Bavli, V'Yerushalmi, V'lo Lashon Deiris, so Hasidin, L'B'Shepet Anchumah. Surely Rashi should have done what he usually does, which is to take the most concise expression, which would have been coming generations, like the Gemara says, and not saying generations that will be in the future, which is more convoluted, and is the Lashon of the Medrash. Especially when you consider that coming generations is a more common expression than generations that will be in the future. Seeing as we know that Rashi's attention to specifics and language usage is so precise, to the extent that sometimes we learn amazing concepts out of the specific language that Rashi uses. Therefore, we must conclude that the reason Rashi chose to say generations that will be in the future, rather than saying generations that are coming, is very precise, and it's got a specific lesson to teach us, and we have to work out what that lesson is. And lastly, Rashi really is only explaining those two words, Einenu poi, not here, who's not here, future generations. Dainu doros hasidim liyos. V'im kein, madua hetek Rashi min hapasuk afas hatevis shelifnei zeh ve'es asher. We know very well that Rashi's choice of headline is very specific. If he's only commenting on the words Einenu poi and explaining that means future generations, why does he include the words ve'es asher? V'loiza bilvad shetek hatevis ve'es asher. Not only does Rashi explain that, use that in his headline, but he explains it. He actually explains what Es Asher means. Va'af im, that the Christus Bris is also with. Which really just seems like a translation rather than an explanation. Doesn't sound like he's really explaining anything. So all of this will be addressed, and all of this will be answered by one shift in our understanding. Up until this point in time, we understood that what Rashi is explaining to us is, how is it possible, because it's clear from the pasuk that there's a Christus Bris with those coming in the future, and Rashi is telling us how it is possible. Actually, that's what we thought Rashi was telling us. Turns out it's not really what Rashi wants us to know. He wants to tell us something more profound. The explanation is, Rashi doesn't have to explain to us how it is possible that a covenant now should impact people who are going to live in the future, because it's actually self-evident. This is not a covenant between two humans, it's a covenant between Hashem and people. It confers b'kosav, as the Torah makes it very clear. Asher Hashem elekecha karisim chayim. It's the covenant that Hashem's making with you. Moving lakol, everybody gets it. That it's really, really obvious that Hashem can make a transgenerational covenant. Why? Because Hashem is not bound by any limits, certainly not the limit of time. Okay, parenthetically, the Rebbe will quickly just address how, even though the wording in the pasuk is Anoichi, don't think that it's Moshe saying, I am human. Moshe making a bris with you. It's Hashem speaking through it. So, because when Moshe uses the words, I am making this covenant, as everybody knows, it's obviously not a covenant between Moshe and the Yidden. Rather, it is a covenant between Hashem and all Jews, Moshe included. So the logical reason why Moshe says, I am making the covenant with you, is because he was the one facilitating the connection between Hashem and the Yidden. Why is this relevant? Because in order to make a covenant, there's actually a physical action that you're supposed to take. As Rashi illustrates, the way you make a bris, he says the way of people to make a covenant is they make something on either side that the people walk through as a symbol of making this covenant. And And so there was an action that Moshe had to take in order to seal the deal between Hashem and the Yidden. Moshe did that, so anoichi. That's why he's saying I. It's so self-evident that Rashi does not have to explain it. Because look, the pasuk started by saying Hashem's making the bris, and it concluded by saying Moshe's making the bris. There's no contradiction. And by the way, it's no different, for example, to where Moshe Rabbeinu speaks and he says, "V'nosati metar artzachem," I'm going to give you rain. Obviously, it's not Moshe who's giving rain. Obviously, it's Hashem, and so this would be the same kind of thing. So what's clear to us is we don't need an explanation. How is it possible to make a covenant now that's going to impact generations that will be in the future? Because you're dealing with Hashem, and Hashem has no limits. וזה גם הטעם בפשטוס לזה, שלא יוצא רש"י לבוא כיצד ציווה הקדוש ברוך הוא למוישה המצוות בכל הדרך, וכיצד בריס בין הפסויים עם אברהם אבינו כל הדרך הבאים, which also explains why Rashi never addressed this issue previously. He never had to explain how Hashem could give instructions to the Jews forever, or how he could make a covenant with Avraham Avinu that would affect future generations. Because the youngest child learning Chumash is absolutely aware of the fact that Hashem has chas v'shalom no restrictions. And therefore Hashem can instruct or contract with all generations across the span of time. And therefore that's not the question. So we originally thought that the question Rashi needed to address was, how do you have a covenant across the generations? Eis asher nenu poi, we know without Rashi, has to refer to future generations, because everybody who's alive is currently present. The Meforshim therefore suggested that Rashi is coming to explain to us now how that is possible. The Rebbe is telling us that's not what he needed to explain, because we know that Hashem can do anything. So what's Rashi coming to tell us? What did Rashi have to teach? Which Rashi tells us in just those sparse words. And also he made the covenant, parenthetically, with the generations who would be in the future. Rashi is not telling us that the covenant extends also to those future generations. Rather, what Rashi highlights for us is how, the manner in which this covenant could happen even with future generations. Meaning, the pasuk starts by saying, not only with you am I making this bris, and this promise, rather it applies equally to those who are here and those who are not here. That's how we're reading it now. That shows us that it's not just I'm making a covenant with you now that will make those generations in the future equally liable to keep these laws. Rather, what Hashem is telling through Moshe is, I'm making a direct connection and a direct covenant right now with you who are standing here, and I'm making a direct connection with those of you who are not yet born. And it's going to be the exact same covenant in the exact same way as with those who are currently here. That's the Chidush of Rashi. That the same way, the same impact, the same impetus, the same closeness, proximity, whatever you want to call it, that's happening to future generations as it is happening to Yidden now. This is actually very clear from the way the pasuk speaks, which is actually, it seems to be longer than what's necessary. The pasuk already told you, you're standing here in order to enter a bris. That's it, you've told me that. Referring to those who are physically standing here, it tells us what the purpose is, to make a covenant. The Torah still goes back and repeats and reminds us. It's not limited to only those who are here. But you just told me everybody is here as part of this bris. Why do you have to say it again? The only reason why the Torah repeats a reference to those who are currently standing here is to link them to those who are not yet here. And to illustrate to us that the nature of the covenant between the two parties, those who are currently present and those who will only be present in the future, is identical. That's what Rashi wants us to know. That explains why Rashi in his headline didn't just translate enenu poi, which is speaking about the people who are not here, but rather the ve'es, the connector that connects those who are currently standing in front of Moshe at the time of this Christus Bris with those who have not yet been born. Or pirush ve'af im, and Rashi points out that means also even with the future generation, which Rashi wants to use to highlight two things for us. Aleph, to show that it's the same immediate, not delayed connection to future generations. Plus, he wants to highlight the ve'es asher to mean you in the future in 2021 are going to have the same Christus Bris as the Yidden had that time where they were standing in front of Hashem. What we learn from this is not only did Rashi not now have to explain, as we originally thought, that the future neshamas were present as an explanation how the bris could affect them, or to explain that a child is an extension of the parent, so if you make a covenant with a parent, it automatically affects the child. Not only did Rashi not want to say that, he couldn't say that. Both of those explanations are actually negated by this explanation, according to the simple explanation. In other words, let's say for argument's sake that our logic of why future generations would be included in this covenant would be because they're an extension of their parents. Then Nitzavim would have no choice but to say would have no choice but to say that there's one kind of a covenant for those who are living in Moshe's time, and there's a different kind of covenant for those who will live in the future. The covenant with those who are physically present in Moshe's time is with them directly, peer to peer. Whereas the covenant with all subsequent generations like us is not a covenant with us personally, it's just a carryover of the fact that our parents once upon a time committed to a covenant and we're stuck with the covenant now as well. Rashi doesn't want to say that. He wants to say that Hashem has a personal covenant with us now as he had with those people then. Likewise, it'd be a similar problem if Rashi were to believe that the covenant made with the people then was in their bodies and with us was our neshamas. Then you'd be telling me that in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, those who lived then, the bris between Hashem and them was both physical and spiritual, connected to their bodies and to their souls. Whereas for us, it's just a connection to our neshama. And that's not what Rashi wants us to see in this pasuk, because Rashi says the pshat of this pasuk is that it's an identical connection between us as it was to the people then. This is the chiddush of Rashi. Ve'es asher enenu poi. It's exactly the same kind of connection for us today as it was for them then. Rashi. So taking Rashi's angle, that the simple understanding of the pasuk is that the covenant is exactly identical even with those who were not present at that time. Which means that there was a direct covenant made then with us, with all generations through time, not because we are the heirs or extensions of our parents. It's exactly the same kind of covenant with body and soul. Especially when you consider what Rashi told us about the nature of how a bris is made. Fascinating diuk that the Rebbe brings here from a pasuk that Rashi quotes from Yirmiyahu. So what does he say? They made the way of making a covenant is you make two things on either side, and the people who make the covenant walk in between. And what happens at that point? Like it says in Yirmiyahu that they took this calf and they split it in half, and they passed through the two halves. When they pass through the two halves, what happens? The two separate parties now become one. That's what the covenant does. It takes the two separate parties and makes them one. Which means whoever walks through those two halves becomes one in this conglomerated reality called this bris. So now that means, besides the obvious, which is that the two parties are now united, the two making the covenant are now united, rather all of those who are party to the covenant become a single entity. So all of the Yidden who are, so to speak, taken through the parts now become a single entity, including us many, many, many generations later. Now we can understand why Rashi did not even have to mention Gerim. Because when you go with Rashi's approach, which is that the covenant that Hashem made then equally impacts every single one of us right across all of the generations in the same personal way, that's obviously inclusive of Gerim. Because it's obvious that when we refer to future generations, it means every single Jew of future generations, no matter how they became Jewish, if they were born that way or they converted. It includes Gerim. Whereas, as we mentioned before, if the only reason we're connected to this covenant would be because we're an extension of our parents, which is something which would not apply to Gerim, or if we wanted to suggest that the original Christus bris with those who were not present was a connection to our neshama, that also wouldn't affect Gerim Kenal. But now that we're saying that it's the exact same covenant that Hashem makes at every point across the historical timeline, that it doesn't matter who you are, and it doesn't matter when you joined the Jewish people, you are absolutely personally connected with that Christus bris like anybody else. The Aderabba. In fact, the worst thing Rashi could have done would have been to list Gerim. In fact, if Rashi would have listed Gerim and said even Gerim are included, it would have sounded like the Gerim have a different kind of a covenant with Hashem compared to everybody else. Rather, Rashi wants us to know that it is a single covenant that was made with every single Jewish person at any given point in time, including Gerim, obviously. You'll ask, but hang on, in the beginning of the parasha, we mentioned Gerim. The fact that near the beginning of the parasha, Gerim were listed as a class within the Jewish people, that's because that was a conversation where the Torah was listing every type of category of Jews. The heads, because there we were not talking about the covenant, we're talking about how everybody assembled and prepared themselves to receive the covenant. At that point we can distinguish between the classes of Jewish people. But in the bris, when it comes time to actually make the covenant, when Hashem says, I am making this covenant with you, at that point it is impractical and inappropriate to split Jews into different kinds of people, because there's the same covenant with every single Jew, no matter who you are and no matter when you lived. And therefore, we understand why Rashi did not want to use the word haboim, generations that are coming, even though it's used in the Gemara, and he preferred to say asidim liyos, that are going to be in the future, because it highlights this point. Now we can understand why Rashi Dafka chose the words generations that are going to come in the future rather than the coming generations. If you use the word haboim, coming generations, it does not sound like it could refer to something which is totally detached from the present. Because haboim pirushoi because logically haboim sounds like that which follows from now, like the immediate following generations. So therefore, if you use the words coming generations, even though that obviously doesn't mean those who are currently here, they haven't yet come, it still links them to the immediately current generation. It sounds like haboim, those who are going to come from this generation. It sounds like those who will be born from this generation. Sounds like they're still tethered to this generation. In other words, it would sound like the current generation is the reason for this next generation. Which would imply that this generation already gives rise to the next generation. Just that they haven't yet physically been born. In other words, it would sound like it would sound like a generation that is an extension of this generation, and that's not something that we want to say. We're going to illustrate this language in a different example, which is quite well known to us from the Rambam. So the Rambam says, why do we call it the world to come? He says, not because that world doesn't yet exist. He says that it is a world that exists now, and he proves it from Psukim. Why is it called the world to come? Because it comes as a result of what you do while you're living in this world. That means to say, in other words, what's his emphasis? Even though it's called ba, something to come, the reality is it exists now. It's only called coming because it's the result of now. And that's what Rashi doesn't want to say about the generations. Why are they in the bris? Because they ba'im, because they're coming as a result of now, the generation that is now. That works against Rashi's pshat. Rashi's pshat is to say that generation independently has a commitment and a connection to Hashem, has the Christus bris, regardless of whether or not they are a result of the generation that is now. So therefore the expression which says they will be in the future, that refers to something which isn't in any shape or form in existence now. Which means not only is it not physically, practically there, but the entire reality of that generation will only come to be in the future. In other words, they're not just simply an extension. That's what Rashi wants us to say. Independent of the generation that lived at the time of Moshe, our generation has a connection and a bris with Hashem. That's why Rashi was so precise and didn't want to use the expression Dorius Haboim. Even though the Gemara used this expression, Rashi did not want to give the impression that what links that person, that future generation to the bris is because their connection to this generation, because they're just an extension of the people in the time of Moshe. Which would be quite similar to the suggestion that how does the generation transact across how does the bris transact across generations? Because they're an extension. Also, if you'd say Doros Haboim, coming generations, which implies generations that come as a result of this current generation, we don't know if Gerim are included. It's actually possible that this expression excludes Gerim, because they're not generations that come from this generation, they come from their own lineage. Told us because they're not the natural outcome of this generation. That's why Rashi Dafka used the expression generations that will be in the future, because he wants to highlight Dafka that it's those generations in the future, in their own independent sense, that have this personal connection and Chris's bris with Hashem. That's why Rashi wants to show us that it has to be that the direct Chris's bris between Hashem and each individual Jew applies equally to future generations as it applied to the people who were standing there, and that we don't have a sort of carry-over connection to Hashem because of our forefathers. And that obviously includes Gerim. That teaches us a beautiful lesson. There's a beautiful lesson that we can extract from this Rashi on a topic that the Rebbe has discussed often. Sometimes a Jew could be a little bit crestfallen, and will lose that full-blown enthusiasm to be able to do Torah and mitzvahs, and may lose the impetus to go out and spread Yiddishkeit, because the person thinks to themselves, who are we? We're just a minority in the world. How can I have an impact? That is answered in this particular parasha. You're right. If we're counting numbers, the Jewish people as a numbers entity have never been a large nation and probably never will be till Mashiach comes. But quantity is something which has its limits, time and space. And if you look at time and space, we as Jewish people are locked into a particular period of time in a particular geographical location. And that's why we're so small. But that's only looking at things externally. But what is the real growth? What is the real power of the Jewish people? Quality, not quantity. Spirituality, Torah mitzvahs. Every single time that a Jewish person connects to Hashem via Torah mitzvahs, which are beyond time and space, at that moment, you, the individual Jew, becomes linked to every single Jew alive today and every single Jew who ever lived. Now suddenly you're no longer a minority at all. That's what Rashi alludes to over here by emphasizing that it is also with the future generations. That you're exactly like the generation who stood there in front of Moshe Rabbeinu making that covenant with Hashem. Rashi is telling us that at that moment that Moshe made the Christus bris between Hashem and the Yidden, every single Jew was there. And not only that, but we were there kulam ki metzius achas as a single organic entity. So mizem move on, from which we can derive shekasher ishi so kosher begolei makadosh baruch hu bivris. Every time I clearly show my connection to Hashem, al yedei kiyum atayro mitzvah befoil, which means when I actually learn Torah and do mitzvahs, then at that moment, at that moment I stand with the support of every single Jew alive and through all the generations, and all together we make a single entity. Then we're no longer a minority, not even in numbers. If that's the case, actually we're a huge number, and we have nothing to be afraid of. And we shouldn't even be afraid of the amount of other people in this world. How many non-Jews there are in the world. To the contrary, they'll be afraid of us. When we stand strong, all of us today, in absolute unison, which means that it's clear that we're standing together as one. Then we're Nitzavim, which means we're strong even in the face of Hashem's judgment, and we're Zeiche Bedin. And that creates for us a ksiva v'chasim atova in revealed goodness for every single one of us.